The silence after Martha died was not merely the absence of her voice. It was the abrupt, deafening collapse of the scaffolding that had supported my entire existence. I am Evelyn, 75, and Martha, my older sister by 7 years, had been my steady North Star, my anchor, and my shield for every difficult day of my life. Her death, quiet and sudden in her sleep, left me exposed, trembling in the cold, unyielding light of a reality she was no longer there to buffer. We were inseparable, not by choice, but by the gravitational necessity of two women who understood the specific, quiet terror of our shared, complicated history. I was the softer, quieter sister. She was the decisive, formidable one. She managed the finances, she handled the confrontation, and she always stepped in front of me when the family's casual cruelty began to sharpen. Now, the house was cold, the colors seemed dimmer, and the weight of being the eldest surviving sibling, the last sentinel of our generation, settled on my shoulders with the finality of a heavy stone. The reading of the will, 2 weeks after the funeral, felt less like a solemn tribute and more like a necessary, unpleasant business transaction. We gathered in the study of Martha's large, beautifully maintained Victorian home. The air smelled of old paper, polished wood, and the faintly anxious scent of greed. The family was assembled. My 2 sons, David and Robert, seated stiffly, exchanging subtle proprietary glances. Martha's only son, Charles, a restless man who carried a perpetual aura of entitlement, and my cousin, Eleanor, a distant, watchful presence. They were not mourning Martha. They were waiting for their inheritance. I sat slightly apart, near the fireplace, clutching a cold cup of tea. I wasn't waiting for money. I was waiting for Martha's final, silent message, a last confirmation of our bond. Mr. Harrison, Martha's lawyer, a tall, skeletal man who looked permanently weary of family drama, cleared his throat and opened the large, leather-bound folder. He began with the formalities, the bequests to a few charities, the small gifts to friends. The family fidgeted, waiting for the substantial clauses. Then Mr. Harrison paused. He removed his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and looked directly at the assembled group. His expression was one of profound professional frustration. "I apologize, everyone. It seems we have a complication." A wave of low, agitated whispers broke out. "Martha informed me 2 months ago that she wished to finalize a substantially revised will," Mr. Harrison continued, his voice heavy with authority. "She indicated a desire to leave the bulk of her assets, including the house, to a single named beneficiary, with specific instructions regarding the estate's management." Charles leaned forward, his face tight. "And? Who is it?" "Just read the will, Harrison." "That is the complication, Charles. The updated will is not here. It was executed, signed, and witnessed at my office, but Martha insisted on taking the original with her for safekeeping, citing personal reasons." A collective gasp went around the room, quickly replaced by angry murmurs. "She always was theatrical," Charles muttered, shaking his head. "However," Mr. Harrison pressed on, lifting a single sheet of paper, "Martha did leave this note, which was affixed to the copy of her previous will, the outdated one. It was written in her own hand, and it is dated the day after she executed the new document." He paused for dramatic effect, smoothing the paper. "Harrison, destroy the old one. The new one is safe. Tell them I left a simple message. Evelyn will know what to do when the time comes. She is the one who will find it. I am counting on her to be brave. Martha." The room exploded. "Evelyn," David cried, My own son sounding utterly bewildered, almost insulted. Why Evelyn? What does that even mean? The old woman's gone senile, Charles declared, standing up. This is nonsense. A vague note pointing to nothing. The estate needs to go into probate immediately, divided equally by law. I sat frozen, the blood draining from my face. Evelyn will know what to do when the time comes. Martha's voice, clear and commanding, echoed in the sudden, frantic silence of my mind. But I didn't know. I didn't know what she meant. I was the one who relied on Martha for directions, for decisions, for the quiet reassurance that my life was proceeding correctly. I was the obedient sister, the careful mother, the woman who had spent 75 years following the instructions of others. What does a woman do when the person who always told her what to do leaves her a final, impossible command? Mr. Harrison managed to restore a semblance of order, explaining the legal necessity of finding the new will. Without it, the estate would revert to the previous, outdated document, or worst, be subjected to a lengthy, complicated legal battle. The family left in a tempest of frustrated rage and suspicion, convinced I was somehow withholding the document, or that Martha had finally succumbed to a capricious dementia. I stayed behind, alone in Martha's quiet study. I didn't care about the money. I cared about the message. I am counting on her to be brave. Martha hadn't just died. She had bequeathed me a riddle, a final, necessary task designed not to transfer assets, but to transform me. The next 3 days were spent in the desolate landscape of Martha's house, a place that was suddenly, brutally unfamiliar without her presence. The family had picked over the house like vultures, searching the obvious places: the desk, the filing cabinets, the safe. They found nothing. I wandered through the familiar rooms, trying to see them not as Evelyn, the dependent sister, but as Martha, the meticulous protector. I realized that everything Martha did was intentional. Every placement of an object, a deliberate choice. Her house was a perfect reflection of her life, organized, elegant, and deeply resistant to easy inspection. I sat in her small, sun-drenched sewing room on the 3rd floor. Martha loved to sew, not clothes, but intricate quilts, complex patterns stitched with painstaking precision. This was her sanctuary, the one room the family had ignored, deeming it irrelevant, woman's work. I looked at the objects: the tall, antique wooden chest of drawers, holding yards of thick, colorful fabric; the small, elegant wicker basket, overflowing with skeins of yarn, and dominating the center of the room, her immense, heavy, industrial sewing machine. It was a magnificent piece of old-world machinery, heavy black iron with intricate gold scrolling, bolted to a massive wooden table. Martha had used it for 30 years, the powerful hum of its motor, the quiet backdrop to many of our late-night conversations. I ran my hand over the cold, familiar surface of the black iron, the scent of machine oil and cotton rising faintly. If you want to hide a truth that must be protected for decades, where do you place it so that no one ever suspects its existence? The sewing machine. Martha loved it, trusted it. It was the symbol of her quiet, disciplined life. I walked around the wooden table, examining the heavy, dark oak. The table was simple: 4 thick legs, a large drawer on the right side for bobbins and needles, and a solid top. But something felt wrong. The top of the table, the space where the working surface extended beyond the machine itself, seemed thicker, heavier than necessary. I knelt down, ignoring the stiffness in my knees, and peered underneath the table. The floor was dusty, untouched. But just beneath the main table apron, where the wood met the metal machine frame, I noticed a very faint line, a hairline fracture in the wood grain that was almost imperceptible. My heart began to pound a frantic, hopeful rhythm. I reached up and pressed along the line. Nothing. I pressed harder. Then, with a soft, almost imperceptible thwunk, a small, thin section of the table apron clicked inward. It was a perfectly designed, spring-loaded lock release. I pressed the section again, and the large, heavy slab of wood forming the table's far end lifted up, revealing a deep, hidden compartment carved directly into the table's structure. The air rushed out of my lungs. It was not empty. Inside, nestled in the velvety darkness, were two things: a thick, legal-sized envelope and a long, sealed letter, both addressed simply to Evelyn. I pulled them out, the paper cold and brittle in my hands. The legal envelope was sealed with Mr. Harrison's official stamp and clearly labeled Martha Hale, Last Will and Testament, revised, AUG 20XX. The will. Martha had not gone senile. She had played a game of immaculate precision, relying entirely on my intimate knowledge of her quiet sanctuary. She had hidden the truth inside her work. I ripped open the larger legal envelope first, my eyes blurring as I skimmed the dense legal text. The essential clauses sprang out at me, bold and undeniable. I hereby name my sister, Evelyn Hale, as the sole executor of my estate. I hereby bequeath the entirety of my estate, including my primary residence and all financial assets, to my sister, Evelyn Hale. I was the sole beneficiary. I, the timid, dependent sister, was now the owner of everything. The shock was immense, not for the wealth, but for the final, staggering act of trust. Martha hadn't just left me money, she had left me power. She had forced me, through the immense weight of her final gift, to step out of the shadows. But the second item, the sealed letter addressed directly to me, was the true heart of the discovery. I tore the thick wax seal, my hands shaking. This was not legal. This was personal. This was Martha's voice, speaking to me from beyond the grave. My dearest Evelyn, if you are reading this, I am gone, and you have found the only place in this house where the truth could be safe. Inside the work we both cherished. You found it because you were the only one who truly saw me, not the role I played. I know you are terrified. I know you look at the will and feel the weight of what I've done to your life. I didn't leave you the money for comfort, Evie. I left it to you for protection. You will need it. There is a secret, Evie, a terrible one, and it is the reason I have always kept you close and managed your affairs. I've hidden it for decades, but you are now the only one left who can manage the fallout. Do you remember 20 years ago when our mother had her final stroke? And the terrible, chaotic mess with the bank accounts and the missing insurance policy? Everyone attributed it to Mother's failing memory, her early dementia. They were wrong. It was not Mother. It was Charles, your nephew, my son. He was deeply in debt. The gambling, the bad investments, and he systematically drained Mother's accounts in the 3 months before her death. He altered the records. He even forged a withdrawal signature on the life insurance policy. I covered it, Evie. I used my own money to repay the accounts, to settle the policy, to ensure no one was ruined. I allowed them, David, Robert, Eleanor, to believe it was Mother's dementia. I allowed the shame of her supposed confusion to protect his monstrous betrayal. Charles is a predator, Evie. He has been watching your savings, waiting for me to die. And the moment he realizes the will is missing, he will contest everything, using the chaos to force the probate court to grant him access to the estate, and eventually to yours. I chose you as the sole beneficiary because you are the only one who will not give him control. They think you are too timid, too gentle. But I know you, Evelyn. You are fierce when you are protecting something precious. And now you must protect your own life and the truth. The moment you present this will, the war begins. They will come for you with every accusation, every demand. They will call you a thief, a cheat, and a liar. Hold fast. Do not let them gaslight you into silence as they tried to gaslight Mother. You were always the soft one, Evie. Now you must be the immovable one. Find your courage. The secret is yours now. The power is yours. Tell the truth when the time comes, but only when it serves your survival. You deserve to be the one giving the orders now. Be brave. Your sister, always, Martha. I sat on the floor of the sewing room, the letter slipping from my fingers, the newly found will lying beside it. The truth was not a comfort. It was a detonation. Charles, my own nephew. The betrayal I had always sensed, but never allowed myself to confirm. The missing money, the chaotic records. It had all been a carefully constructed lie Martha had maintained for 20 years, allowing her son's greed to poison our shared history, all to protect my fragile belief in the family's decency. The grief for Martha intensified, transforming into a deep, agonizing respect. She hadn't just been my shield. She had been a warrior, fighting a solitary, silent war to protect me from the rot at the center of our family. I looked at the sewing machine, the heavy, silent sentinel of our shared secrets. I was not just holding a will. I was holding the key to a 20-year-old crime, a secret so vast it had redefined my reality. The immediate terror, the fear of confrontation, of the ugly, brutal war Martha had predicted, was immense. I was 75, soft, and completely unprepared for battle. But then, I remembered the tone of Charles's voice in the study, the contempt in his eyes when he dismissed my connection to Martha. I remembered the years I had spent quietly accepting the lesser role, allowing the others to believe I was incapable of complexity or strength. And I realized, Martha had not just left me the money. She had left me the role. She had given me the final, necessary stage to stop being Evelyn, the obedient sister, and to finally become the formidable, decision-making woman I had always hidden. I stood up, the stiffness in my knees irrelevant. I gathered the will and the confession letter, tucking them into the secure inner pocket of my coat. I was the sole executor. I was the sole beneficiary. I was the keeper of the most damaging secret. The fear was still there, cold and sharp, but now it was overshadowed by a profound, righteous fury. They wanted to contest. They wanted chaos. They wanted to prove Martha was insane. I would give them proof of something far more devastating. I would walk back into that study, not as the timid sister, but as the new matriarch, armed with the undeniable truth and the silent, commanding approval of the woman who had finally freed me. The war had begun, and for the first time in my life, I was ready to lead. The air in the sewing room, once thick with the scent of old fabric and oil, now felt charged, metallic, like the moment before a lightning strike. I sat motionless, absorbing the devastating clarity of Martha's sacrifice. She hadn't just shielded me from Charles's greed. She had shielded me from the knowledge of that greed, preserving my fragile, curated belief in the fundamental goodness of our family. She was protecting my innocence, even as I aged. The burden of the truth was immense, far heavier than the will itself. The money was merely a tool. The confession letter was the weapon. I stood up, the stiffness in my joints forgotten, replaced by a sudden, intense rigidity of purpose. There was no time for soft, tearful grief. Martha's final command was not a suggestion. It was a military directive. My first act was one of supreme caution. I needed to act as Martha would have, meticulously, decisively, and entirely alone. I did not call Mr. Harrison immediately. I needed to establish my own perimeter. I walked to the kitchen and made a pot of strong, bitter coffee, then retrieved my coat and keys. I drove directly to my own bank, opening a large safety deposit box under a new, separate designation. I placed the original, newly found last will and testament inside, along with Martha's confession letter detailing Charles's 20-year-old crime. This was my fortress. The proof was now outside the jurisdiction of Martha's house and the immediate reach of my family's panic. The next call was to Mr. Harrison. His voice, when he answered, was tight with legal anxiety. "Evelyn, thank God. The family has been impossible. Charles is threatening to file immediate paperwork with the surrogate's court." "I have the will, Mr. Harrison," I announced, my voice steady, sounding surprisingly like Martha's own. A long, shocked silence stretched across the line. The new one? The original?" "The original." It was exactly where Martha said it would be. "I need you to schedule a second reading immediately. Tomorrow morning, if possible. And please send a copy of the new will, certified, to Charles's lawyer today. Let him know the document is authenticated and witnessed." "But Evelyn," he stammered, recovering slightly. "Where did you find it? And what about the note?" "You'll know what to do?" "I knew where to look, Mr. Harrison," I stated, allowing a flicker of Martha's old, dismissive authority to enter my tone. "My sister left instructions only I would understand. I am prepared to move forward immediately with the executorship, and I will require a meeting with you this afternoon to discuss the transfer of assets and to review the legal standing of Charles's previous actions." I hung up, feeling the final, irrevocable break with my old self. I had just issued 3 commands, dealt with a complex legal maneuver, and executed a decisive strategy, all within the space of 15 minutes. The woman who had needed Martha to order her lunch was gone. I spent the rest of the day in a state of high, cold alert. I did not return to Martha's house. I went home, locking my doors and silencing my phone. The emotional weight of the confession letter was immense. I read it again, sitting by the dying light of my own window, tracing the shaky lines of Martha's final script. She had protected me. The thought was a painful, searing brand. I realized that my entire adult life, the sense of ease, the lack of real financial anxiety, the simple, quiet assumption that things were correct, was an illusion Martha had tirelessly maintained. She had lived with the terrifying knowledge of her son's criminality, the fear that he would eventually move from preying on his grandmother to preying on his aunt, and she had compensated for his betrayal not with pity, but with a massive final act of empowerment. She forced me into the light. Does true love consist not of endless comfort, but of the final necessary removal of the very crutch that enabled your dependency? I thought of Charles, his smooth, practiced entitlement in the study, his eagerness to declare Martha senile simply because the will wasn't where he expected it to be. Martha's letter had not only revealed his past, it illuminated his present intentions. He was not just greedy, he was dangerous. The fear of confrontation was still a cold knot in my stomach, but now it was anchored by a furious, protective instinct. I was no longer protecting myself. I was protecting Martha's final, magnificent legacy. I would not allow Charles to sully her memory by allowing him to succeed in his second attempt at financial sabotage. The second reading of the will the next morning was not a meeting. It was a detonation. I arrived at Mr. Harrison's office, dressed not in my usual soft pastel cardigans, but in a structured dark navy suit Martha had tailored years ago and had insisted I keep. The clothing itself felt like armor. The family was waiting. Charles, flanked by an aggressive younger lawyer, David and Robert, my sons, tense and confused, and cousin Eleanor, watching from the corner with detached interest. The tension in the small room was suffocating. Charles's lawyer, a man with a perpetually condescending smile, immediately addressed me. "Mrs. Hale, my client insists on a full disclosure. Where exactly did you claim to locate this supposed new document?" I looked at the lawyer, then directly at Charles, allowing my gaze to hold his cold, calculating eyes. "It was where Martha intended it to be," I stated calmly. "In the hidden compartment of her sewing machine. A place, I suspect, you were never allowed to frequent." The revelation of the hiding place, the ultimate symbol of their dismissal of Martha's domestic life, hit them with visible force. Charles's face went white. Mr. Harrison immediately began reading the revised will. The room remained silent until he reached the crucial clause. "I hereby bequeath the entirety of my estate to my sister, Evelyn Hale." The ensuing chaos was exactly what Martha had predicted, a high-pitched, furious cacophony of betrayal and accusation. "This is fraud!" Charles screamed, leaping to his feet. "She was clearly not of sound mind. This is coercion. You manipulated her, Evelyn." David and Robert, my own sons, looked at me with a mixture of confusion and profound disappointment. "Mom, you didn't tell us you were the beneficiary? Why did you hide the will?" Robert asked, his voice laced with wounded accusation. I let them talk, allowing the poison of their assumptions to flow freely into the room. I waited until the noise reached a fever pitch, and then I lifted my hand, a small, authoritative gesture that silenced the room instantly. "The accusations stop now," I said, my voice quiet, cutting through the noise with an almost physical force. "I am not a cheat, Charles. I am the sole executor and beneficiary because Martha understood exactly what she was doing. She gave me the power to stop the rot in this family." I looked directly at Charles, meeting his furious, panicked glare. "You will not contest this, Charles. You will not file suit, and you will not spend one more cent pursuing a fight you cannot win. Because if you do, the first act of my executorship will be to hand over to the district attorney the documented evidence of your systematic theft from our mother's estate 20 years ago." The room plunged into an immediate, profound silence. The other family members looked between Charles and me, stunned. Charles's face was a mask of cold, white terror. The bank records, the insurance forgery. Martha had documentation for all of it, I continued, speaking slowly, deliberately, giving each word its full, devastating weight. "She covered your crime to save your reputation, Charles. I have the confession letter she wrote and the bank statements she reconstructed. I have the power to destroy you, and I will not hesitate if you attempt to complicate the legal administration of this estate one more time." The silence held. Charles, beaten, utterly exposed, sank back into his chair, his lawyer staring at him with dawning horror. I had done it. I had used Martha's secret not just for protection, but as a final, decisive act of power. I was no longer the timid sister. I was the keeper of the truth, the new, fierce matriarch, and the sole sovereign of my own dignity. The war was over, won with a single, devastating move. I looked at my sons, their faces registering the shock, the complexity, and the sudden, terrifying respect for the woman they realized they had never truly known. My journey had just begun. The aftermath of the second will. Reading was not a quiet peace, but a profound, necessary silence. The silence that follows a surgical strike. Charles, utterly neutralized by the threat of criminal exposure, withdrew immediately, his lawyer issuing a tight, professional statement confirming the estate would proceed without contest. My sons, David and Robert, however, remained. Their initial reaction was a bewildered, painful mixture of shock at Charles's 20-year deception and a deeply confused respect for me, the mother they had always perceived as gentle, non-confrontational, and largely incapable of decisive action. That evening, they came to my house. Not to demand explanations or accuse me of withholding information, but simply to sit with the complexity of the revealed truth. "Mom," David finally said, his voice low, filled with a fragile emotion. "Aunt Martha? She knew all that time? And she never said anything?" "She never said anything because the truth would have ruined Charles's life and shattered Mother's final days," I explained, stirring the tea I had brewed, feeling the unfamiliar weight of the secret now shared. "Martha chose to protect the structure of the family, even if it meant absorbing the poison herself." "But why you, Mom?" Robert asked, looking at me with those direct, searching eyes that always made me feel judged. "Why leave you everything? Why force you into this fight?" I looked at my sons, seeing them not as demanding adults, but as men facing the sudden, terrifying realization that their foundation, the stability of the family, was built on a heroic, necessary lie. "Martha knew I needed to stop hiding," I confessed, the admission feeling raw but cleansing. "She knew that the inheritance was the only way to give me the power to speak the truth. She didn't leave me money, boys. She left me command." The change in our dynamic was instantaneous and profound. They no longer saw me as the elderly mother who needed care and monitoring. They saw me as the custodian of the family's integrity, the only one capable of wielding Martha's immense, difficult power. When you finally stop playing the small, obedient role others assigned you, does your true self become the greatest gift you can offer your children? My life immediately began to expand, filled not with the drudgery of maintenance, but with the strategic work of creation. I moved into Martha's house, not out of necessity, but because the house was the physical embodiment of my new role, the hub, the center of gravity. I didn't sell the house, as the family had morbidly anticipated. Instead, I began restoring it, using the substantial funds Martha had left. I focused specifically on the sewing room, honoring the sanctuary where the truth had been kept. I installed immense, bright new windows, flooding the space with light. I meticulously restored the heavy sewing machine table, leaving the secret compartment intact, a permanent physical reminder that true power is often hidden inside the quiet work of women. I started taking classes at the local university, not to pursue a degree, but simply to satisfy the relentless, curious mind Martha had always believed I possessed. I studied architectural history, fascinated by the silent stories held within old structures. My relationship with my sons transformed entirely. David, who struggled with a floundering nonprofit, came to me not for a loan, but for advice. He sought my counsel on how to navigate the difficult politics of his board, skills Martha had quietly taught me over decades, skills I had never realized I possessed. Robert, the meticulous accountant, helped me set up the complex trust funds for Martha's various charities, working with me as a partner, not a superior. We spoke not only of money, but of morality, of the difficult ethical choices that governance demanded. I was no longer their mother. I was their mentor, the person who had finally stepped up to define the family's ethical architecture. And Martha's final, most powerful gift was the liberation from my own timidity. I started saying no to invitations that bored me, yes to travel I had always feared, and speaking up in public spaces where I had previously remained silent, allowing my voice to be heard. I hosted a dinner party for the entire extended family, the first since Martha's passing. The atmosphere was strained, uncertain. They were waiting to see what the new, formidable Evelyn would do. I didn't mention the will, the theft, or Charles. Instead, I stood up at the end of the meal, raised my glass, and toasted Martha. To Martha, I announced, my voice steady and clear. She taught us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. And she taught us that the most important work in a family is the quiet, difficult work of protecting the truth. I looked around the table. The silence was profound, filled with acknowledgement and a cautious respect. I had become the matriarch, not by decree, but by bearing the full, luminous weight of the truth. I would never again be the timid sister. I was the keeper of the secret, the protector of the foundation, and the woman who had finally, gloriously, claimed her own command. The work of building my new life, a life of courage, curiosity, and uncompromising truth, had just begun.